And in particular, the thick line in the figure refers to the individual's average level of self-control over a period of several months. And this average level is what researchers have in mind when they refer to self-control, and it represents self-control as a background factor. And so some individuals on average are high in self-control, some individuals on average are low in self-control. But what I argue is that their level of self-control fluctuates somewhat around this average level. And this fluctuation is largely a function of the events to which they're exposed. So, for example, on average, you're high in self-control. But maybe one day you have a dispute with someone else, you get really angry, and that leads to a temporary reduction in self-control. So normally you're a cautious person, you think before you act, you're slow to anger, etc. But one day you have this really bad day, few people really tick you off, and all of a sudden, that particular day, you have a short fuse, and something little sets you off. And so while on average you may be high in self-control, a particular event may lead to a deviation, a temporary deviation from that average or typical level of self-control. Likewise, in some cases, maybe something happens. You have an individual, for example, where on average they're low in self-control, but maybe something happens that temporarily increases their level of self-control. They notice that maybe the school security officer seems to be keeping an especially close eye on them. They driving in their car and they have a close call. They almost get in a life-threatening crash. And so for the next several days, they're especially cautious. They're stopping at all the yellow lights, etc. So in any event, then, what I argue is that, yes, we have these background factors. Yes, we can categorize individuals as, generally low in self-control, generally high in parental supervision. Usually they associate with delinquent peers, etc. But most individuals deviate around their average or typical level of self-control, parental supervision, association with delinquent peers. Now this argument, as I say, is at odds with most criminological theory and research. Most theory and research assumes that variables like self-control, parental supervision, association with delinquent peers are reasonably stable over periods of several weeks or several months. But again, I disagree, and I argue that this depiction in the figure that's up on the transparency more accurately reflects reality. And I argue that in part based on my own experiences, and would ask you to consider your experiences. Look at your own life. You may be an individual, for example, who generally high in self-control, but like all of us, occasionally you may have that bad day, nothing seems to go right, and once more, you may find that for that particular day, you have an especially short fuse. And at the end of that day, someone says something to you that you don't like, someone looks at you in the wrong way, and you may find yourself getting a little aggressive, getting a little violent. So that's the essential argument. That's sort of the essential difference between background factors and storylines. Background factors, once more, refer to the individual's average or typical standing on a range of individual characteristics, a range of environmental variables. Storylines represent sort of temporary deviations from that average, from that typical or modal standing. Deviations initiated by events, and I'll describe some of those events in a minute. So that's how storylines differ from background factors. How do storylines differ from situational factors? Well, situational factors refer to the characteristics of the individual and the individual's environment immediately before the crime occurs. What is that individual feeling right before the crime occurs? What is the situation or setting like right before the crime occurs? Now, the situation in which a crime occurs may be part of the story told by the offender, but storylines usually transcend specific situations. And in particular, the events that initiate storylines are often far removed from the situation in which the crime occurs, and the consequences of these events often last from hours to weeks, spanning a range of situations. So, storylines then differ from background factors in the ways that I've indicated, differ from situational factors in the ways that I've indicated. They constitute sort of a new set of factors that may contribute to crime. Let me give you an example that demonstrates the importance of storylines, an example that is drawn from a classic study of gangs by Short and Strobeck. And Short and Strobeck conducted one of the first modern studies of gangs, focused on gangs in the city of Chicago. And they went out in the field, spent a lot of time observing these gangs, talking to gang members, and based on their examinations, they described one major type of storyline that contributes to crime among gang members, and that type of storyline involves what they call, quote, status threats. So, for example, in one case study, there was a gang leader named Duke, and he was sent to jail for a period of time. Now, when he was sent to jail, the gang elected a new president in his absence, but they did that with the understanding that when Duke got out of jail, he would again be made president. Well, when Duke got out of jail, the gang held a celebration, but there was no formal recognition made of his leadership. They didn't formally acknowledge that, yes, you're out of jail, now you're president of the gang again. Well, this apparently upset Duke, and then he started acting in a very aggressive manner, often instigating fights with the other groups, sometimes on the basis of very little or no provocation. Well, after Duke had done this for a while, Short and Strobeck report that Duke once again adopted the, quote, cool image that distinguished him from the other gang members. That is, he began to act in his normal, cool, restrained manner. Well, Short and Strobeck say that the reason for Duke's highly aggressive behavior is that Duke was really upset that the other gang members didn't acknowledge that, yes, you're president upon his release from jail. And so he had to demonstrate that he was the toughest in that particular gang. And so he goes out and starts picking fights left and right. And eventually the gang once again formally acknowledges that, yes, you're the toughest, you're the president. And so he calms down and he stops the aggression. Well, if we want to understand Duke's aggression, we can't fully understand it in terms of background factors like his low social class, the values that he holds, the fact that he's a member of a gang. And we can't fully understand it in terms of the situations that Duke has encountered. To fully understand his aggression, we have to know something about the storyline that he was involved in. And the storyline involves a status threat. He gets released from jail. There's no formal acknowledgement that, yes, you're now again president. He becomes upset for a period of time, and he starts committing a lot of aggressive acts. Okay, so once more then, and especially for the benefit of those of you who have just come in, we have these three major sets of factors that contribute to crime. We have the background factors, the individual's average or typical standing on a range of individual and environmental variables, background factors like low self-control, parental attachment, etc., considered in all the major crime theories. We have situational variables, circumstances immediately before the crime occurs. And then we have this new set of factors that I focus on, storylines, which refer to the events and conditions that lead up to a crime or a series of related crimes. Well, what I'm now trying to do is identify some of the major storylines that lead up to crime, some of the major events and conditions that lead up to crime.